My presentation will try to explain this topic in a very practical way regarding the difficulties of contract law in the present situation. Just a minute. So, this topic takes place in a context of health crisis and important geopolitical events, also Brexit. The COVID-19 combined with the related regulatory measures have resulted in difficulties or even impossibility of executing many current commercial contracts. In addition, French companies have not been able to measure the increase in the cost of their contract with British partners due to the Brexit. In this context, the force majeure and unforeseen circumstances, théorie de l'imprévision in French, will be studied, two legal tools to protect companies against the unexpected. So, how to deal with the unexpected? Comply with contractual provisions. The contract is the law of the parties in the French Civil Code. The parties are obliged to perform their contractual obligations. The judge, third party to the contract, can interfere in the contractual relationship only on the basis of strict conditions. Also, with the French reform of contract law, 2016, several legal provisions give the judge the right to interfere in a contract in the event of a significant imbalance in the parties' obligation due to an unforeseeable event or change in circumstances. Second point, give priority to settlement solutions before to bring legal actions. Regarding the legal aspect, the parties have to respect the principle of good faith. Regarding commercial and economic aspect, settlement solution may help to save time, energy, and money. Third point, renegotiate or terminate the contract through the French legal tools, force majeure or théorie de l'imprévision. I translate in English unforeseeability. In this context, the contractual partners could provide for some specific clauses. A théorie de l'imprévision clause, in English, a material adverse change clause, a force majeure clause, a Brexit clause, or even specific clauses providing for renegotiation or termination of the contract. In the case of a specific event, for example, change in regulatory framework. A contractual mechanism could also allow a settlement renegotiation of the contract. In French law, there is also the exception of non-performance. In French, exception d'inexécution. The right of a party to suspend the performance of its obligation as long as its counterparty has not performed its obligations. But the exception of non-performance can only be invoked if it provided for in the contract and for the simultaneous performance of reciprocal services. Finally, concerning the good faith, another major change of the 2016 reform. Under the terms of the new Article 1104 French Civil Code of the French Civil Code, the principle that contracts must be negotiated, formed, and performed in good faith is now a matter of public policy. Whereas paragraph 3 of the former Article 1134 of the same code simply stated that the agreements must be performed in good faith. Therefore, since 2016, the parties have the obligation to apply the principle of good faith from the time of negotiation and drafting the contract. And the French law reinforced this principle with the public policy nature. In practice, the parties will show good faith by transparent negotiation, full information, favoring settlement solution, accept a contractual revision if the terms of the contracts or the situation allows it. So the main legal tools to protect against the unexpected is the force majeure and the unforeseeability. But what this concept means, what are the conditions required, and how can they be applied in practice? The impossibility of performance required by the French text refers to a real impossibility and not to a simple difficulty in performing the obligation. Thus, if the debtor can perform the contract, is obliged to do, even if this performance becomes very onerous for him. Concerning the burden of proof, it will be for the party invoking this principle to justify its impossibility and not just a difficulty to implement appropriate measures allowing the performance of its obligations, as well as the causal link between the cause of force majeure and the non-performance invoked. In the absence of such justification, the debtor should pay damages in accordance with the French Civil Code. So what are the consequences of the force majeure? If the prevention, empêchement in French, is temporary, performance of the obligation is suspended unless the delay which results justifies termination of the contract. If the prevention is permanent, the contract is terminated and the parties are discharged from their obligation. The question is, COVID-19 is a case of force majeure? A study of the historical case law shows that the existence of an epidemic is not sufficient to constitute force majeure. Therefore, a case-by-case analysis is necessary. At the national level, French law adopted on 23 March 2020 declares a state of health emergency with a legal protection put in place since 12 March 2020. At the international level, the World Health Organization has declared COVID-19 a public health emergency of international concern on 30 January 2020. It follows that the criteria of externality and unpredictability should not be an issue for contracts concluded before that date. However, in my opinion, contracts concluded at the beginning of 2020 will be analyzed more closely. Indeed, can we consider then on 3rd January 2020, when the World Health Organization announced the pandemic, the event was still unpredictable? Or should the starting point be on 12 March, the beginning of the French legal protected period? Please also note that the parties have the possibility to arrange in the contract the qualification of the difficulties generated by the COVID-19 as force majeure and its condition of application. Also, remember that the fact that the performance of a contractual obligation becomes more onerous does not justify the qualification of force majeure. The second question is, Brexit is a case of force majeure? Concerning the criteria of unpredictability, it will be necessary to show that the event was unforeseeable at the date of conclusion of the contract. If this argument seems relevant for contracts concluded before the date of the referendum on 23 June 2016, the issue will be more delicate for contract concluded after that date. The condition of irresistibility should also be met. However, as everybody knows, the application of these rules is in the discretion of the court. Concerning the théorie de l'imprévision, unforeseeability. It is quite a new concept in French law, which allows one party to request a revision of the contract when three conditions are met: a change of circumstances unforeseeable at the time of conclusion of the contract, a performance which would have become excessively onerous for the other party, and the absence of a clause showing acceptance of such a risk by the affected party. Also, contractual adjustments are possible. Since the provision of Article 1195 of the French Civil Code don't have a public policy nature, the parties may decide not to apply unforeseeability to a contract or to determine its scope in advance. Concerning the application in time, the unforeseeability clause is applicable to all contracts concluded since 1st October 2016. It is only applicable to contracts concluded earlier if it's expressly provided for. So, the same question for the force majeure. COVID-19 is a case of imprévision. With the French reform of the contract law in 2016, several legal provisions give to the judge the right to interfere in the event of significant imbalance in the parties' obligations due to an enforceable event or change in circumstances. Concerning the enforceable change of circumstances, it is generally accepted that the COVID-19 could not be reasonably foreseen. The condition of enforceability would be met for obligation subscribed before the pandemic. The change must be enforceable at the time the contract is concluded. Also, for applying this principle, the contract should not provide an acceptance clause showing acceptance of such a risk by affected party. Concerning the excessively onerous obligation, a case-by-case analysis is required. It is also difficult, in my opinion, to appreciate this principle of excessively onerous in the absence of a legal definition and case law. This new article is recent. And however, I consider that the principle of excessively onerous, for me, is not a situation that will make me less money, but something that will make me lose money. The second question, Brexit is a case of imprévision, unforeseeability. The criteria are the same that we see before. Unforeseeable change of circumstances. It will be necessary to show that the event was unforeseeable at the time the contract was concluded. While this argument seems relevant for contracts concluded before the date of referendum, 33 June 2016, the issue will be more difficult for contracts concluded after that date. The second criteria, absence of an acceptance clause. For example, the so-called Brexit wall clauses, which the object is to minimize or exclude the parties' rights to invoke Brexit or its consequences. Finally, excessively onerous obligation. We need to proceed to a case-by-case analysis. And as we see before, it is difficult at this stage to appreciate this principle. So what is the difference? What is the difference between force majeure and imprévision, enforceability. Force majeure and enforceability have in common the enforceability of an event after conclusion of the contract, but they differ in that force majeure makes impossible to perform the contract, whereas enforceability makes it excessively onerous. Enforceability does not have a suspensive effect on the performance of the contract, unlike force majeure. Therefore, during the contract revision procedure, the party must continue to perform the contract, and in a situation of force majeure, the performance of the contract could be suspended also. What is the strategy? The parties are obliged to continue to perform their obligation during the unforeseen event. This obligation limits the interest invoking enforceability, in particular for debtors affected by the health crisis. Nevertheless, enforceability appears to be a useful basis for adapting the contract to the difficulties encountered by one party as a result of pandemic. A contracted party who cannot perform its obligation due to the current economic context may notify to the other party a force majeure event and invite it to negotiate a revision of the terms of the contract. And if the other party refuses, a reminder of the public policy obligation to perform contracts in good faith could be useful. In any case, a case-by-case analysis is necessary. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alberto, for this presentation on another aspect of contractual schemes. I suggest we have a discussion after your presentation right now, because your presentation is more or less linked to the other session on contractual schemes, and François Xavier will address a very different issue. So if François Xavier agrees and allows, maybe we could have a discussion right now on Alberto's presentation, and maybe on other contractual issues raised in the previous session. I see that Régis has a comment, at least. I don't know if Régis...
Hi, Alberto. It was just a comment regarding, the contracts regarding ARNH and the use of the force majeure that was defined differently within the contract and by the civil code. And do you have any insights?
Do you have any
insights regarding that?
Maybe Régis, especially for our foreign colleagues, if you could just precise what ARNH means it's in the power regulation, I guess.
We are using nuclear power. Nuclear power was sped largely by French citizens, but used by EDF. So when there was an opening to competition, the idea was to allow also competitor to have an access to ARNH. So they had the possibility to buy a certain quantity of electricity within a certain limit at a price that was fixed. I think it was something like 42 euros. And because of the coronavirus, of course, they ordered way more, because you have to order in year N-1. And so they order way more than what they were, what they needed. And prices after the lockdown just dropped dramatically. And Total and other companies decided to say force majeure, so I do not have to abide by the contract. And to buy the quantity of electricity, that I said I will buy to EDF. And then you had a huge evolution because the Creux said there is no problem. The Council of State said there is no problem. The Tribunal de Paris said there is a problem. The Cour d'appel de Paris said there is a problem. And then the Creux said we need to change the contract.
Okay, thank you. So Alberto, I have also another example. It's you know, the use of force majeure in the lease, in the commercial lease between the owner and the lessor when it comes to rent a building or a lot for a business which is considered as non-essential by the COVID regulations, meaning that these businesses should actually be closed. And there were, even within the Tribunal Judiciaire de Paris, I believe there were conflicting decisions on the use of force majeure. But I leave Alberto.
I think that in this period there is a large case in force majeure, much better than before, because before when you draft a contract, the clause of force majeure is not really the main clause of the contract. So I see some contracts is 4 lines, so old contract. Now we have case law with force majeure, with the COVID, with the Brexit. So I think that we also have to wait the new case law for understand how the judge what is the interpretation of the judge in the time, because I think that the force majeure how was interpreted before will not be the same since the COVID and the Brexit. Maybe I think that it is good to arrange the force majeure in a contract. Also, if you have a public policy nature, and also for the COVID, for example, to have a specific COVID clause in a contract, different from the force majeure, because today the COVID is not a force majeure. You know that there is a COVID, so it is not unpredictable. I think also that it will be interesting to wait for other case law for the future, and I think that this last year we have many decisions.
Louis Bernard, I think you wanted the floor, maybe to ask a question. I don't know.
Not really at this point. Thank you very much, Bertrand.
And Benedict had a comment, I think, in the chat.
Yes, thank you, Bertrand. Just a comment. Thank you for this very good presentation on force majeure and imprévision. However, what I think is that in such times we need to go beyond what has been put in to the contract and even beyond the law, because eventually the question also is who can bear the burden of the epidemic. And it shows how important it is, and perhaps we haven't stressed that enough while we were all reflecting on the French contract law reform. It shows how important it is to realistically see how contractual clauses are going to be enforced. And I think that eventually judges also have their word to say in this respect. And what we have seen recently shows that we cannot predict everything in the contract.
Yes. Alberto, do you wish to react? Or?
No, I agree. I think that we learn also today the real meaning of the force majeure, and we have some contract is 2 pages on what is force majeure. I think that the force majeure will be more helpful than the théorie de l'imprévision, in my opinion, and in the practice. Normally, is the force majeure that the parties, one party invoke, and not the imprévision. But I'm agreed with also with the comments of Benedict. So.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we'll switch to the next presentation of François Xavier, who, by the way, I think is raising his hand. By the way, just a hint at imprévision. You know that it's a concept which is derived from the Conseil d'État case law, and to be honest, it's very, very seldom enforced by the Conseil, by the case law of the Conseil. But yes, maybe yes, because there is an asymmetry between the supply, the private supplier, and the public body, which is procuring some goods or services.
In public, yes. In the public law, sure. Sure.
If I may, I believe that imprévision somehow is good to start a discussion, but not much more than that.
Okay, that's a good transition, François Xavier. Maybe do you wish to present your PowerPoint presentation?
Okay. Yes.
You have to. Il faut cliquer sur présenter maintenant en bas de l'écran, yes, et prendre l'option une fenêtre.
A window and...
Voilà, une fenêtre. Voilà, et choisir la fenêtre que tu as qui correspond à la présentation ouverte.
Yes, so I've opened from your site, which is in there. But if I click that, the problem that I don't see. I've opened it. Sorry for that. I've opened it, but yes, let me see.
Ça y est, ça se met en marche. Ouais.
Okay. No, you don't see. No, you don't see it.
Ça y est.
Do you see? Do you see, yes, the slides?
We see. We can see. I can see the slides.
Yes.
Your first slide. Oui, c'est bon.
Okay.
Merci.
Okay. Thank you. And if I do this, yes. Okay. Fine. So yes. So to finish with, I have a bit more relaxed presentation. It's the composition of the world. It's based on a book from an anthropologist called Philippe Descola, and the title is Shading or Habits as a Starting Point for Thoughts. And the purpose of this talk is not to give any sort of advice on what to do or not to do the day after, but I think that this is the type of moment which is good to revisit somehow our belief, what we think as certain or what we value as absolutely necessary. Somehow it's a good moment for what I would say a Cartesian doubt. Thus the doubt concerning the truth of our perception about human relationship, or even about our political and economical belief. So in this context, stepping aside by looking at societies founded on radically different principles and values can be useful. And this is what I propose to do based on the Composition des mondes, or the composition of the world, from Philippe Descola. It's a book which was written in 2014, and Philippe Descola is an anthropologist, as I say. He's currently chair of anthropology at the Collège de France, and he spent several years, end of the 70s, very end of the 70s, with the Ashwar tribes. The Ashwar tribes, it's a It's part of the Jivaros group. It's in the Amazon forest, mainly in Peru and Ecuador, a little bit in Brazil also, but mainly Peru and Ecuador. And from that, and from his time with the Ashwar, he developed a number of views, and in particular, a new approach to understanding the distribution of continuities and discontinuities between humans and non-humans. And so I was willing, as an introduction, to show to you two very different tribes, one from the Alps and the other, which are the Jivaros Ashwar. The tribe from the Alps you can see them mainly in Saint-Sauveur or places like that, and the Jivaros Ashwar, as I explained, they are more in Peru and Ecuador. So as an introduction, so again, the book was written much before the pandemic, but he was asked to do some talks following the pandemics, and he has generally a provocative but interesting way of expressing himself. And I've translated two of his quotes. He said, "The pandemic condenses not any particular society's singularities, since the pandemic is global, but certain features of the system which govern the current world." And he said also, "A virus is a parasite that replicates at the expenses of its host, sometimes to the point of killing them or killing him. And this is what capitalism has been doing to the earth since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, for a long while unknowingly. Now we know, but we seem to be afraid of the cure, which we also know, namely an upheaval of our lifestyles." So that was for this presentation. I will divide some thoughts on the pandemics and some parallel with the Ashwar. I will divide in four parts: time issues, knowledge and belief, thoughts about political, economical, and social organization, and one legal consideration to finish the presentation. So this pandemic questions our relation to time, to predictability and disruption. And since the beginning, we have had the impression of living all at once with recent but irretrievable past, an undiscernible future, and a present which seems to stutter, the bégayer, to repeat itself by going around in circles. And I think that the different shapes and forms of the confinement is a good example of that. We must once again be able to project ourselves into the future. I think it's a necessity that everybody feels very strongly. And interestingly, I think that in particular at the end of the first confinement, we see many utopias and many attempts to invent or reinvent a post-pandemic world. And it became more frequent after the first confinement. And so it means when a time ground to a halt. It's interesting to see that we are starting to somehow to reinvent our society when we stop running and rushing everywhere somehow with no direction. And the concept of time with the Jivaros Ashwar is very different. Among the Ashwar, mythological time dominates because such a time creates a permanent and fertile ground for social interaction between humans and non-humans, and we will discuss and come back to this after. On the other hand, the Ashwar do not really cultivate any strong connection with history and heritage, and this is something which is I don't know if it's related to the fact that they are in the Amazon, where the word transforms itself very quickly, but it's true that their memories somehow are not older than memories about their parents or their grandparents. They don't cultivate any strong connection with this, and somehow this relationship they have with history, or this light relationship they have with history, can lead to a feeling of certain freedom from history's weight. We could elaborate more, but we won't have time. So I'm going to the second part, which is knowledge and belief, highlighting two characteristics. I think that our Western world, it's fair to say that our Western world is often hold knowledge as superior to belief, and what we can see from that COVID related uncertainty and the newly overwhelming presence of death, somehow it has disrupted this order of things, because death is probably one of the last remaining strongholds of belief in the face of verifiable knowledge within the modern hour. Somehow this crisis is changing the status and the relation between knowledge and belief. A second characteristic that I would like to highlight is the uniqueness of historical moments is often appreciated through its representation and belief. And we very often live, or I have the impression that we very often live in a world where reality only exists, is only recognized as real when it's captured by images, by imagery, even as representation of reality has never been somehow so easy to fake. If I switch to the Ashra, the Ashra would give an equal weight to material and mental realities, and this is something very, very strong and very interesting when you read about them. The use of their environment is put to never distinguish from its symbolic nature. They establish a very direct relationship between the use of nature, their belief of regarding it, and how they subsequently represent one and the other. And again, we will come back on this. And as we said before, among the Ashwar, a myth is a thought experiment, une expérience de pensée that establishes the conceptual basis for their relations with the world, particularly with non-humans, who are seen as having similar inner lives to ours or to theirs, to the Ashwaras, but in very different bodies. And this is something which is strange, but they very often talk and interact with non-humans because they believe that the inner lives, l'intériorité of non-humans are similar to theirs, but they have a different body, a different shape and form, which may stop the interaction, but they can find this interaction in different ways, and we will talk about that in a minute. What I can say is that Western political philosophy runs somehow a similar experiment when its story tells or social contracts, le contrat social, as the end of the vicious state of nature in order to legitimize concentrated political sovereignty. Just as Hobbes' state of nature is a state of fiction, it never existed and will never exist. It is a state of fiction established to enable our social arrangements. Mythological history among the Ashwar lays the ground for their understanding of and their interaction with the world that surround them. And mythology, and somehow I can believe that it was the same with the Greeks in our Western world. The mythology has this strong ability to make us interacting with the world that surrounds us, even the world that could be valued as unnatural or different or non-human here in the case of the Ashwar. So on social, political, and economical organization, the Ashwar, it's interesting, do not live under any institution common to urbanized society, such as lineage, such as caste system, for example, or elites or concentration of power. They don't have a state or anything which look like that. The Ashwar grants to non-humans a very specific and important place in their social life. The appearance of structuring institution, such as a state toward which legitimate authority and legitimate violence are relinquished by its citizen, may simply be the empty sign of an attitude that extends social value well beyond the limits of humanity as a species. And they truly, again, and this may be strange to us, but they truly socialize with plants, with river, with animals. So for them, socializing, it's really not limited to humans. And I can say that the apparent lack of structuring institutions, such as those of a state, to which we have transferred the care, the law, the order, we have transferred using violence, creates the condition to extend sociability well beyond the borders of humanity as species. And really, it was fascinating to see that the Ashwar have developed a way of living together that has absolutely no equivalent to the West. The Ashwar civilization is, of course, naturally far from ideal. They are not what we can say a bon sauvage. War ethics and revenge often take a very important place in their society. But the other, whether the other is human or the other is animal, for example, whom we fight or hunt, is never depersonalized, as it is the case in our Western war, where mostly we just count a high number of deaths and nothing more. The enemy is a person like me, a person respected and regarded as a condition to my own life. So it is nonetheless a group that live by its own rule outside the classic subjugations of the state. And without idealizing the Ashwar, I think they form a society where social ties are very rich, even in violence. Talking briefly about economy, the Ashwar are taking into account the productivity of their gardens. They set many gardens in the Amazon forest, and they used to establish a village, and then they burn their village and they go to another place, and again they establish new gardens around. The yields of hunting and fishing, and the Ashwar have enough to feed 2 or 3 times their own people with that condition of living. And rather than conceding to anything close to our industrial work schedule and maximizing its extraction from the environment, the Ashwar work only 3 to 4 hours a day to provide abundantly for their needs. And they have really no desire increasing their working time to intensify production or create new needs. and the rest of the free time is mostly devoted to social interaction with human and non-humans, to craftsmanship, art, dance, and things like that. And apart from few metal tools and cotton fabric, the Ashwer have no manufactured goods, no money, no paid labor or income of any kind. And as we could have expected, there are very nice and quite funny pages from Descola in La Composition des Mondes when he was returning to France after several years with the Ashwer, because he found himself with a society of abundancy and what he calls commodities fetishism, and that was very, very strange to him, as we can imagine. Social organization, the Ashwer, I hope you can see the photo. This is a Ashwer home. The Ashwer live in large houses without any interior partition. In one house, there are big houses, dozens of adults and sometimes 25 to 30 children. In their houses, people gather, and I found that very interesting. People gather around a fire shortly before dawn to comment on each other's dream. So this is the first thing they do on the day. They gather and they tell, each one whenever they can remember, of course, one tell about their dream, and they discuss collectively about the dream to try to determine the portent they bring for the day to come and times to come. So this is part of, I would say, the socialization activities. And what they say is that in their sleep, the dreamer's soul moves without any constraints outside his body, and will then meet all kinds of interlocutors who present themselves in human shape and form. Whether these interlocutors, it could be a plant, it could be an animal, it could be, but then them, in order to interact, they come in human shape and form, and the dreamer thus come into contact with the spirits of the plants, the animal, about the spirits of mythological heroes as well as the dead, who can then at this occasion bring messages to the dreamer, and the dreamer then will share it before dawn with the rest of the community. Another interesting social interaction is a kind of magic cantilenas, and these are very hushed songs that the Ashwer address to the soul of human, but also to the soul of non-human, whom one wants to reach in order to, for example, appease a particular conflict, kindle one's love, or, for example, to enter into communication with protective plant or with some of their plants of their garden. And this is a meditative form, a meditative process of relating to beings which can be humans, but which can be non-humans. And when they are non-humans, of course, they are deprived of linguistic expression, although they seem as having attributes recognized by humans. And it's a way to come into contact with their basic personhood. To finish again, I can speak a long time about this, but time is short. So to finish, I will talk about legal consideration, and I can say that law can help to lay the basis of new relationship between our civilization and non-human entities, following what we've just said, whether organic, geological, or atmospheric. And warming to a political attitude whereby Earth is seen as a common house over which humans do not have an exclusive right should somehow compel us to also consider some pioneering moves which was made by some foreign states and courts, which have given legal personality to living environments, such as mountain, river, territories. Their legal personalities were officially recognized. They have been declared as capable of asserting their own interests through sponsored, so human-sponsored, whose well-being depends on that of their principle. And I think such move emphasizes the needs of solidarity between species, identification with an environment, concern for others, and balanced spaces in our lives rather than on competition, on private appropriation, and maximum exploitation of promises of life. And of course, as I think most of you, especially lawyers, know, the most striking case to date is that of the recognition of the legal personality granted to the Manganui River in New Zealand, which was taken, the river was taken not only as a waterway, but as a complete and coherent ecosystem. And I think this should not be outlandish to Western eyes. And somehow, just like the Ashwa, we can say, oh, it's a very different society, but it has been done before in Roman law, which granted ownership of the land to the gods and its stewardship to the temples. Human commodities' legal legitimacy over natural entities would lay, in fact, in the fact that they lived on, say, the river edge. They contributed to its welfare and thus saw it as contributing in return to these communities. And the generalization of such attitude beyond the stage of a single incursion into a system not yet changed by it would require a profound overhauling of classical philosophy approach to property. And for those who are interested in relation to that, I quote a book which is Être la rivière, comment le fleuve Wanganui est devenu une personne vivante selon la loi, de Sacha Bourgeois-Gironde. And also I can lead you, he's not here today, but I can lead you to a podcast, a very interesting one from Antoine Garapon in France Culture, which is called Esprit de Justice. And it's called La rivière est-elle une personne pour le droit? And I found this podcast again, and such as the book from Sacha Bourgeois-Gironde, very, very interesting. And I recommend it. So that's it. I think I spent a little bit more than devoted time. And just to finish, this is a photo of Philippe Descola when he was with the Ashwa before entering into the Collège de France.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, François Xavier, to have introduced several tribes from the humanities, from Saint-Sauveur to the Amazon forest. Any comments? And Louis Bernard is doing some comments in the chat. And Eric, you wish to intervene? So I give the floor to Eric and then to Louis Bernard.
Very briefly, before I visited Bougainville in Papua New Guinea, that's an island out. A different population actually lives in Papua New Guinea. It's a plank-tall population. I studied with my wife, who is a social anthropologist. We studied all the literature on the islanders. And there is a book by Douglas Oliver, which is actually putting on prior research by a number of Germans who studied the island before, because, as you may know, Papua New Guinea was for a short while a German colony. And Oliver is putting on them. and he describes the CY people, and it's the same tale. The problem is, of course, always with these tales that they are have this famous problem of living nearby, living with them, and being different, and understanding them, and the interpretation of them, which is, of course, amply described in the anthropological literature. I mean, it's very, very difficult to assess the claims, the stories which are being told, and the perception of these stories. There is these emic and ethic approaches. I'm not sure whether you have really dug deeply in that literature. I mean, it's part. If you study anthropology, you're obviously concerned with the measures how to study it.
Yes.
These results, are they lettre persane, or is this again a tale of Jacques le Fataliste? Or I've just read these two books recently, Lettre persane once again, and also Jacques le Fataliste, for understanding the world a little bit better, as you were interested in these stories. But as I said, we really spend a lot of time sitting in Stanford and reading these books on the CY, because we arrived there, and then there was this big, huge mine, the Bougainville mine, which is actually closed again. It's a $3 billion investment, copper, gold, silver being mined in a volcanic area. And I was charged with looking at the mine, writing reports on that mine, and studying the mining contracts. I mean, that was my business in the time when we visited there. But we first wanted to get the sociological, the anthropological based framework in which that happened. And the tragedy was, of course, the change of the people and the change of the attitudes. I mean, if you looked at Douglas Oliver's story, and then the move into the modern societies with caterpillars moving very blasting off mountains. I mean, enormous masses of soil being blasted away, and the island partly destroyed for opening this huge open pit mine, because a very dramatic inroad, which was never fully understood by the local people which were sitting there, because it was incomprehensible what the investors did there. I mean, it was simply not understood. The communication between the investors, or they had all kinds of anthropological help there, but never reached agreement on certain things, because they were simply living in a different world and couldn't really find an understanding about certain issues. I mean, they got money, but they said, well, this is not an amount of money which we're compensated for, which will be sufficient for anything. And it's not meaningful for us to get this money. But the whites, I mean, the investors said, well, they get enough money for their fishing grounds or their gardens or whatever. So, I mean, there was disagreement, and finally it ended in a war, and the mine was closed. I mean, this was one of the largest investments which I investigated in my studies in the late 70s, which was really finally cancelled, and it's now a big hole full of water. And it didn't work because there was shooting, looting, and all kinds of things happening, and was closed down. Very tragic story. Bougainville was one of the stories of the Harvard Business School cases. This is why I looked into it. And it was ridiculous if you saw the discussion at the Harvard Business School about Bougainville and the reality which you would see on the side. But this is, I mean, simply the cultural clash, which you have to fix also if you live in Paris and think about these people. I mean, it's probably a cultural clash which you cannot fix.
Louis Bernard.
You
Sorry.
can't write about it. You can't at least write about it. This is what I found. I couldn't write about it for 3 years. Also, I'm a writer.
Louis Bernard, you had a comment on an experience with the actors.
Well,
And François Xavier maybe will respond.
Yes, first of all, I'd like to thank François-Xavier Velasquez for his very interesting presentation, which took an entirely different track of what we discussed earlier, and I like that. I think it opens our minds. Yes, I have a friend, a close friend, who has spent quite some time with the Ashwars, and he has actually written about that and made also many photos which are interesting to look at. And I think that you brought very interesting points, because the world outlook can be entirely different. And you made very important points about what is a legal person. Because I'm a lawyer, I react to that. But yes, these are important points. The only comment I really wanted to make is that I personally didn't go to the Amazon. I haven't seen the Ashwars, but I went 2 years ago to the center of Australia and spent a little time with the Aborigines. And like the Ashwars, their beliefs are centered on various myths, which Eric called tales, but they are more than tales because they live their myth. They dream about their myth, and dreaming is very important to the Aborigines, just as it is apparently for the Ashwars. And the point I'm making is that if you believe that the time you live in is the same as what the myths are telling you, are actually explaining the meaning of your immediate experience, is framed by the myth that you're dreaming.
Absolutely, absolutely.
There's no difference, so to speak, or there is a continuity between the perception of reality as you see it when you're awake, and the perception of another reality that you're getting while you're asleep. Then your whole worldview is different. Is different from ours. And we could elaborate on this, and we don't have time really, probably this evening. But I'd like to tell you, in reaction to what Eric Chancel just said about his experience in Bougainville, that there's also a similar experience, less tragic, fortunately, in Madagascar, about mining by Rio Tinto, where Rio Tinto was informed of what had occurred in Bougainville, probably, and didn't want to repeat the same mistakes. So they connected with the communities that were threatened, or they were on the path of what they were going to mine and harbor and create, in order to try to understand what was the acceptability of a project to the community, to the local community. And they negotiated with the community and understood that some things are sacred to them and cannot be paid for in money. So they backed off. So in a way, you learn from those mistakes. If you study, if you do a case study, you can actually get a higher level of corporate social responsibility, which is one of the things I will talk about tomorrow. Sorry for having been a little long.
No, can I say something? Or
François-Xavier, yes, of course, François-Xavier.
First, thank you very much, Louis. I fully agree with what you say, and I think you say it in a very clear way. And I also very pleased to see Eric again. Pleased to see you again. And I think two things that I would like to say as a reply to what you just mentioned, Eric, is first, one of the things which has always been very critical and very important for Philippe Descola is the way of when he's there spending time is what is the part which is really from the Ashwar, and what is the part from his cultural approach, from where he's coming from, and so on. And he spent a lot of time by not only studying the Ashwar, but then working with students, other anthropologists, studying with different societies like that, just to cross analyzing what they say, and from that to frame it in a very precise way. And the other thing I would like to say is that when you are socializing not only with humans but also with non-human, where your social life is very central to your environment, when the environment is changing, just like it's the case now in the Amazon where there is a lot of destruction, when your environment is changing, your whole life, your whole society, the whole equilibrium could be ruined, could be completely ruined. So it's something which is very, very important and very important to consider.
Yes, it's a life or death situation.
Yes, exactly.
I had a comment which is well, to be frank, I am too Cartesianist to be ready to grant legal personality to plants or rivers or things like that. And maybe I think Régis put a note on the chat. Maybe we share with Régis the same reluctance. I wanted only to make a remark. You know Christian Huguelot and Corinne Lepage. Corinne Lepage was the former Ministry of Environment, I think during the Chirac era, the President Chirac era. And Christian Huguelot, his husband, is a very famous attorney at law. He was the both were attorney at laws in the famous Torrey Canyon cases, and they are now advocating to give rights to I would say to elements of of nature. So this is actually something which is gaining interest in France and in Europe, but still I have some. This is puzzling me because I think it's. I wonder if we do not use the wrong instrument for a good and positive objective. Well, I mean, my Cartesianism is too much shocked to be able to enter into such a scheme.
But Bertrand, if I may somehow just think that New Zealand law is common law, so it's a colonized law, and somehow to look at what are the beliefs of local communities is interesting, and not just to impose your system of law, our system of law, where property is the principle, where humans have a right on the earth as a property, but see it as more as interaction, and then from that belief to try to change what we have always believed. I'm also a lawyer. I'm also a codified Western lawyer. But I think as a transformation to the society, to think about that, to try to really study it, and to try not to come with all what we thought, and this is very Cartesian somehow, which is to revisit what we thought as true.
No, that's not Cartesian. It's Europeocentrism, like
somehow it could be useful, and to have a relationship between for example, the river. What I find interesting is that what the legal personality was not granted to the Manganui River, but to the whole ecosystem of the river, which means also to all the people, all the tribes who are living with that, and it changed completely your relationship with nature. And somehow, with the current ecological crisis, to start thinking about in that direction is interesting. At least I'm not saying that we all have to embark on that, but as a thinking and as a legal thinking is very powerful and interesting.
I take once again the floor and then give it to Alberto. I agree with you on the limit of a top-down approach and sort of legal colonialism. And I all the more agree with you, as that was part of my debate with the World Bank in the doing business case. You know, the report of the World Bank, but also when I was working in the bank itself. My recommendation would be more first to work with anthropologists, as maybe as you are trying to do or to advocate, François Xavier. Secondly, is to try to transpose their norms, because actually any society has norms, even if it's very, very different from our concept of norm. By the way, I prefer to use norms rather than rules as a word. And to give you an example, and I think maybe Regis, who worked in Mongolia, has the same maybe at the same point. When I was working in some African countries where actually you don't have any property law for real estate, especially for agricultural estate, because you know you have the tribes and the cattle, which is going back and forth on the same land, etc., etc., etc. And of course, we were at the bank at a time where the motto was to privatize land, to have cadastre and to privatize land. And then my point was actually to try to translate the customary law into concepts which we Westerners may understand. And by the way, I went back to some kind of either communist law, you know, when in the USSR the land belonged to this community, and also to some very old French public law, le droit des communs, and les sections communales, you know, les biens sectionaux. That's something which, by the way, we know very well in the Alps, because you know, the community has a right on the forest, which is the property of the municipality. Okay, well, I'm too long. Alberto, I think, had a point, and then maybe
yes,
we will close. Thank you.
Thank you, François Xavier, for this very interesting presentation. I have not a question, but an observation, because your presentation reminds me a quote. The world is not given by his fathers, but borrowed from his children. I really like this quote. And your presentation also reminds me the recent ecological damage decision by the Paris Administrative Court, the l'affaire du siècle. So it's very d'actualité.
Thank you.
Can I have the floor for 1 second, please, Bertrand?
Yes, sure.
I'm sorry for being so talkative, but these are interesting discussions, and I simply would like to make the point that we are maybe too European-centric here, and you could also rely on the case law in the US about Indian tribal lands. You have all this body of case law fought, including in the US Supreme Court, to restore the rights of tribes, of prime nations over land that was taken away from them by force, by the army in the 19th century. So these legal moves, these legal fights have been successful in the US and in Canada as well, where large tracts of lands have been given back to the tribes. So I think that we should look at this phenomenon as a world phenomenon, not only from a purely South American or Oceanian or other or Siberian aspects.